Hello, ladies and gents. We're on the module A328. Block 4. How are empires experienced? This is the Open University module, edited by Cole Hack. On page 386. Unit 19, Indian decolonization. The period up to the First World War, thus saw the growth of nationalist movements, debate over what anti-colonial methods to deploy, deliberately limited concessions by the colonial government, and an electoral framework. Good morning, whoever that is. Happy day to you. The fostered communal representation. Happy New Year, I say. What happened when this met with what Chatterjee sees as the first big conjuncture in Indian decolonisation, the First World War? The First World War began in 1914 in Unit 17. You saw how the Ottoman Empire's entry into the war pitted the Sultan Caliph against the entity powers, including Britain, who ruled over the largest number of Muslims in the world. This raised tensions among many of Britain's Muslim subjects, including in India. The global nature of the war led to unprecedented demand for material and manpower. Over 1 million Indian soldiers and a similar number of labourers served overseas. How did these affect developments in India? Let's familiarise ourselves with the chronology below for 1915 to 1922. We can discuss the Chatterjee. Think of the First World War affected India. The next, we can see in the activity how she portrays the First World War and its intermediate effect from 1914 to 22 as a conjuncture that jolted decolonisation forward. Looking at a secondary source in 19.2, Chatterjee, to 1914 to 1922, from Flanders to Chori Chara in decolonisation in South Asia. When we start to read, we can try to identify two or to three of the main logical and global elements that come together to drive forward Indian decolonisation in this period. Looking 1940 to 1922, from Flanders to Chori Chara, colonial rule in India was a bricolage, a congruence of complex and fluid relationships. It was never spread evenly across the subcontinent. It penetrated some regions more deeply than others, and caught particularly social groups more intensely in ever-shifting webs of collaboration and extraction. For purposes of analysts, three types of relationship might be identified. First, there were the unequal and often uneasy alliances between the British imperial establishment and their so-called collaborators, drawn from Indian elites. Princes, landlords, community leaders, mercantile elites, and high estate, or Ashraf, educated Indians who helped govern the empire. Second, there were relationships based upon the extraction of labour. Peasants growing cash crops for export, workers in the public and industrial sectors, bonded and indentured labourers on their plantations. Lascars who travelled the high seas in the service of the imperial economy. Sepoys who mained the Indian army, as well as huge cohorts of lowly constables, village chowkidars, village watchmen, merchant servant or guard, and patvaris who represented the realities of rule closer to the ground. Third, and at the broadcast level, there were the connections that existed between the Raj and its ordinary subjects who, more or less aided by the law and paid taxes, but these were fragile linkages and bonds. Some were built on face to face interaction between rulers and ruled. Most were rather more intangible relations derived from notions of subjects or namak. Literally, salt denotes ties of loyalty between the subjects and ruler. The reality to Huckman or will of the British Shakar, given how thinly the British presence was spread, Indian intermediaries meditated between the Raj and its numerous subjects. In almost every sphere of governance, decolonization in South Asia is best understood as an intricate process by which these relationships unraveled at different levels of imperial engagement, at different speeds and different locations. The process was never a smooth linear movement along the high road to freedom. Along the way, there were starts and stops, spurts and lulls, with more crises and corners being negotiated and then open roads and clear destinations. It is only recognised the intricacies and complex interplays, both temporal and spatial, that we can begin to grasp what decolonisation was and still is today. But when and where did the process begin? With no singular origin for a process of this complexity, I focus instead on critical junctures, moments of acceleration and of crisis. The First World War and its aftermath, sadly, still an understudied subject from Indian perspectives, was the first such major occasion when the concerns of Indians were propelled into an unprecedented confrontation with worldwide crisis. For one, the war drew Britain into a head on collision with the Ottoman Sultan and Caliph of Islam in ways that deeply tested the loyalty of Rajas of India's Muslims. As Muhammad Ali wrote, the attitude of England toward its enemies of Turkeys, Persia, and Morocco had begun to alienate the sympathies of Indian Muslims ever since 1911, international developments which had resulted in the disintegration of the already enfeebled power of the Islam. After the war pushed Indian Muslim supporters of the Caliph into open confrontation with the British, not unlike the Revolutionary Garda revolt, with which it was loosely connected. The Caliphate movement was simultaneously local, national, and global. Its most expansive goals, as the Mayor Ramnath has noted, could only be really imagined and enacted outside the country, but it was also substantially located within India, in local communities rallied by ulema, students and journalists writing for a buoyant Urdu press in a formidable agitation against the government. The First World War also sucked labour out of India and flung it abroad into strange lands. Never before, as Ravi Ahuja writes, had rural people from the Indian Afghan frontier region and Nepal, from the Punjab and other military recruitment grounds of British India, engaged with European societies and as intensely. More were non combatants, but most were soldiers, and most, half of them, were from Punjab. Ever since Munity in the Punjab was the province on whose loyalty the Raj had relied most heavily, and where hundreds and thousands of sepoys were now recruited from wartime duty outside India. In peacetime, annual recruitment in India army was about 15,000 men. During the war, it rocketed upwards to almost 1.3 million men over 4 years, almost a million of whom were pressed into service overseas. At no previous moment in history had South Asians entered Europe in comparable numbers. Haj reminds us many of these sepoys were Punjabi villagers who by 1919 totaled a staggering 44.5% of the entire Indian army. They found themselves fighting at Flanders, the Somme, Ypres, Neuve Chapelle, and Gallipoli, in conditions for which they were helplessly ill prepared. For the first time in history of the sepoy armies of the Raj, other than the very different context of the Munity, they engaged white troops in battle. Tens of thousands died. One sepoy from the Punjab, Santa Simph, wrote to his mother from the hospital in Britain where he lay wounded. Many sons of mothers, brothers of sisters, and brothers of mothers have been lying dead for a whole year on the field of battle. A year has passed, and they lie. He, he, he who sees for the first time says, "There's no place empty." So many corpses are there, and all have perished in 40 seconds. They too are the children of mothers. Like Santa Symph, many more were injured, while some were treated in Britain at the fanciful Forks Indo-Islamic Pavilion at Brighton. Large numbers end up in German prison camps, where the potential for subversion was enormous. At these camps, the POWs learned in the aphoristic words of Sib Symph and Sikh peasant from Amritsar about the fatalities of the empire. The Angres Englishman and Badshah Emperor in India, and we did not know where the other Bashars elsewhere. When the war began, we heard of several Bashars. One flaw in India is that the people are without ilm knowledge. Returning from the front, they brought back from Europe this knowledge to the villages and towns of Upper India, as well as other seditious ideals. For half a century, the Raj had done it almost to insulate the Punjab and, above all, its soldiery from the contagion of politics. But now, paradoxically, it was the Punjab that became a critical site from which the politics of decolonization were to set into motion, and which was a epic centre from where protests radiated outwards in the Punjab and beyond. The taxation burden upon Indians, already heavy before hostilities, grew increasingly onerous during the war. In 1917, India had to contribute an outright gift to its imperial overload of 100,000, a sum nearly twice India's net annual revenue. Before 1914, Indian mercantile groups resented the heavy taxes on sales and on super profits now slapped upon them. Even the government of India, previously Westminster Complaint Agency in Delhi, began to sense that this unremitting pressure on Indian taxpayers was unsustainable and began to endanger its political purposes. In 1918, the Army Department in Delhi told the India Office, in no uncertain terms, that the drain in money and material and resource of India cannot any longer be met without the gravest embarrassment. In December 1919, the Viceroy Chelmsford was seven more blunt. I must point out that to you, India is in this way being exploited by the War Office because they find that they can maintain Indian troops abroad without those extremely objectionable questions in Parliament, which would be asked if they were British and non-Indian forces. This growing discord between the perspectives of HMG in London and the government in India and Delhi, which came to a head after the war ended, is a striking and often overlooked dimension of decolonisation in this period. This parting of ways was reflected above all in India, an increase in autonomy tariffs, particularly on cotton, seemingly so potent in the 19th century. Dewey notes Lancashire's ability to dictate Indian tariffs ended the First World War in 1917. The government of India more than doubted the duty of cotton imports in the main from the United Kingdom from 3.5 to 7.5. In the 1920s, it rose to a further to 11%, and in the 1930s, it stood at approximately 25% on all the British peace goods and 50% on all goods from elsewhere. And already by the end of the war, India was beginning to emerge as a distinct national market. The army, Britain's imperial garrison in the eastern seas, also faced serious questions about its future use. Above all, about who would pay London or Delhi when it was deployed outside India for imperial purpose. Even before the First World War ended, then much had changed in the structure of colonial relationships, which provided the context for the historic announcement by Montagu, Secretary of State, in August 1917, who promised an increase in association of Indians in every branch of government. The significance of the government's failure to keep word promptly must set it against its backdrop. Promise are dangerous things, particularly when they are large and promises are imprecise, as the government's hint that an undefined responsible government was on its way. They unleashed hopes that the cautious reforms of the post-war Raj never satisfied. In March 19, Gandhi launched a nationwide campaign. A harticle or strike, contrary to his intentions, it turned violent in some places. Notably in the Punjab, the Raj was nervous, particularly about the loyalty of a province that had long been bulwark of its rule. The public turned af- ugly after the government reacted by extreming popular political leaders from the province. The Black Roll-Up Bill, which extended the draconian powers of wartime government into an era of peace, was another flashpoint. On the 13th of April 1919, Baisakhi Day, the start of the Punjab New Year and the anniversary of the birth of the Sikhism, General Dyer ordered troops to fire on a peaceful crowd and gathered at Jallianwala Bagh, an enclosed walled part in Amritsar, in the heart of the Punjab. Just a stone's throw from the Golden Temple, casual figures remain in dispute, but in the carnage of that garden, over 500 people lost their lives. The event marked a profound and irreversible blow to Raj claims to legitimacy in their Indian empire. Well beyond the Punjab, where the aristocides took place for a great many Indians outside the province, particularly the educated middle classes who had valued liberal possibilities of imperial subjecthood. A dream ended abruptly with Jallianwala Bagh. Amongst those from whom this was Damascene movement was Mohandas Karmchand Gandhi. Gandhi, it is well known, had served as a loyal subject of the King Emperor in the Imperial Ambulance Corps in South Africa during the Boer War, and as a staunch supporter, sometimes even a recruiting sergeant of the Allied cause during the Great War. But after 1918, in a concatenation of global and local concerns, the Khilafat and Punjab wrongs, as Gandhi described them, convinced him that the Albion was perfidious and the Raj morally bankrupt. Gandhi's political message represented a frontal assault on the relationships of imperial collaboration and a clarion call to cut ties of the sentiment that underpinned British rule. In his seminal treatise, Hind Swaraj, written in 1908, on board a ship to India and South Africa, Gandhi had insisted that the British rule in India rested not on conquest but on the collaboration and collusion of Indians seduced by Western materialism and the siren calls of modernity. If Indians withdrew their cooperation from the Raj, so Gandhi's thesis implied, it could not survive, now signalled the time had come for them to take the step. At the 1920 Nagpur session with the Indian National Congress, Gandhi urged Indians not to cooperate with the British rule and to refuse non-violently to obey its unjust laws. If the facts of the government, if the acts of the government be wrong, it is clear we must refuse to submit to its official violence. Appeal to Parliament by all means if necessary, but if the Parliament fails us and we are worthy to call ourselves a nation, we must refuse to uphold the government by withdrawing cooperation from it. At Nagpur, Gandhi got his non-cooperation result through at the session packed with angry Muslim Khilafatists by skillful tactics and opportunism combined with a brilliant grand strategy. Gandhi captured Congress, outflanking many more established Congress leaders who were puzzled by his idiosyncrasies, alarmed by his alliance with the Muslim Caliphate leaders, and unconvinced by the merits of the policy of boycotting elected councils in the provinces. A year later, When he launched the non-cooperation movement, Gandhi promised to achieve Swaraj, self-rule, within 12 months. He could not, of course, deliver, but the movement gained a far larger, more broad-based and desperate following than anything the Congress had achieved before. In part, this was because Gandhi had already enlisted powerful friends and constituents in regions outside the usual bases of the Congress, rich peasants, mill owners, and mill workers in Gujarat, prohibitionists in Karnataka, and caliphatists in North India in Bengali, who were able to mobilize their own networks beyond local campaigns of unprecedented strength. In these campaigns, they enlisted social groups of Raj they had previously relied upon to be neutral, if not effective, loyal to imperial order. But winds of change were blowing. Gandhi couched his political message in a language, both symbolic and semantic, which altered Indians understood and with which they could identify. When Gandhi discarded suits made from the British cloth and instead wore a tiny strip of fabric he had woven on a simple spinning wheel, he advertised the predicament of Indian weavers and artisans for centuries in subcontinental statecraft. Just wool required the government to tax fairly and lightly, to patronize handicrafts, and to husband the resource of the land. By adopting the spinning wheel and the khadi hand loom cloth, Gandhi signalled to the very Indian that British rule was failing in these duties, and hence legitimate. By urging Indians to break government's monopoly over the production of salt, Gandhi drew attention. Again, symbolically, since the cess of salt was minuscule to the unjust burdens of taxation that the British rule had placed on India, since salt was a metaphor in India for the symbiotic relations of obligation and loyalty between rulers and ruled. By urging the people to make their own salt, Gandhi had sent out a highly charged signal that the people of India should withdraw their fealty to the British overlords. As Raj Narayan Chandavarkar suggested, Indians' working classes were often inspired by Gandhi's theoretic because of his canny ability to develop the blandness metaphor and the most platitudinous action in a distinctly subversive direction. Ironically, however, Gandhi's success in becoming a Mahatma of the mass compromised to his control over the direction of the movement he had started. The denouncement, the denouement come to Chori Chara, a village in the North Indian district of Gorakhpur. Inhabitants of this hamlet, convinced the new utopia was just over the horizon, burnt hapless Indian policemen alive for standing in their way to put their little station to the torch. This dramatic instance of violence prompted Gandhi abruptly to call off the non-cooperation movement of 1921 to 22, thus ended in confusion and disarray. Of course, the politics of non-cooperation floundered after this, and of course, as scholars have noted, the end of the cooperation was followed by a decade of apparent calm. But the events between 1917 and 1922 represented a decisive shift in relationship between rulers and ruled. Much had been damaged in the fragile web of imperial relationships. It was the first major crisis of the bumpy road to decolonisation. But was decolonisation still proceeding at a pace by 1923? After non-cooperation was halted that year, let's look at what happened in the rest of the interwar period. The interwar Chatterjee argues that Britain was in dire need of strategy to deal with the impact of the First World War on its control of India, as explored above. Indeed, the war impacted the wider empire as unrest rocked places such as Ireland and Egypt. In India, Britain's chosen strategy was to retreat to the centre, This meant keeping British control at the centre of colonial power in Delhi, overseas as such defence and security with limited Indian representation. In the province, meanwhile, it would mean gradually increased Indian participation in diverse areas of provincial governments. British officials hoped that granting limited powers to the Indian politicians in the province would deflect Indians from seeking powers over the centre. In areas such as defence that were seen as vital to imperial security, this defection would also hopefully refresh and strengthen the relationship with Raj relied on how well Indians would gradually get elected posts in the provinces, giving them access to influence over policy and patronage. The first major step was the institution of diarchy, dual rule in the province by 1919 Government of Indian Act. This meant elected Indians were gradually given control of more and more areas in each province, such as education and public works, though overshadowed by the 1921 to 22 civil disobedience campaigns started to work in practice. The second major step was the Government of India Act 1935, effective from 1937. This act did two things. First, it provided for a limited increase in Indian representation at the centre, but only if enough princely states signed up, which stood up to the Second World War. They did not. Second, it provided for almost self-government in the provinces with a vastly expanded electorate of more than 35 million people. Indians were to control almost all areas of provincial administration, what we might call departments in the UK. It's subject to vetoes by British provincial governors. Chatterjee thus asked, was the interwar period in some ways one of the declaration, with decolonization proceeding at a slower pace? The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 was, according to Chatterjee, yet another major conjuncture, bringing another jolt forward in Indian decolonisation. We will look at the detail. For now, let's introduce you to an Indian nationalism and its key players as they emerged from the First World War onwards. Indian nationalisms and its key players, Gandhi, Nehru and Jinnah. Chatterjee has come up with the invaluable term Indian nationalism. That was a bricolage, and the term made up of diverse types of imperial, of different ideas that existed together in cooperation and opposition at different times and places, reflecting the diversity of South Asian politics and political imaginaries. You read short a summary of what Indian nationalism was in section 1.1. The ideas shaped Indian nationalism did not exist in this abstract. They were made by individuals and groups. Activities 1906 and Secretary 1903, 1905 provide a brief introduction to three of the most important Indian nationalists, their lives, activities and ideas, while many have lauded them over their contributions to Indian freedom. None were without their controversies, including their political ideas and public statements of events, their political and personal philosophies and personal relationships. Mahatma Gandhi, by name of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, born October 2nd, 1869, Porbandar, India, died January 30th, 1948 in Delhi. Preeminent leader of Indian nationalism and a prophet of the non-violence of the 20th century. Gandhi grew up in a home steeped in religion, and he took for granted religious tolerance and the doctrine of Ahimsa, non-injury to all living beings. He studied law in England from 1988 to 1891, and then in 1893 he took a job with the Indian firm in South Africa. Then there he became an effective advocate for Indian rights.